That beautiful sound, which was just played, is the epitome of polyphonic clarity that Pierluigi Da Palestrina became so well regarded for in the beginning of the 15th century. The piece is called Missa Pape Marcelli, and as we will see, it's one of the most famous pieces he has composed. Pierluigi Da Palestrina is certainly one of, if not the most well-known late Renaissance composers. Having grown up in the small town of his namesake, his talent from a young age soon drew him to Rome to lead a choir. He proceeded to hold numerous jobs involving participating in or leading choirs throughout the course of his life, and this close involvement with music put him in the perfect position to make music composition the focus of his life. The majority of his works were sacred and are seen by many as the pinnacle of pure divinity in music. Listening to some of his compositions is like hearing angels singing. It's that beautiful. And the sacred intent of these pieces really shines through even outside the context of a traditional Roman Catholic church. The musical styles of polyphony and counterpoint were so noticeably refined and popularized by Palestrina that it is frequently referred to simply as the Palestrina style. This style had immediate impact and had lasting influence on other composers in subsequent time periods, including famous ones such as Liszt and Bach. In this video, we are going to investigate Palestrina's life and legacy, and gain a clear understanding of how his work represents an important step in the development of music. First, we'll go over the timeline of Pierluigi's life, and see what exactly this legendary composer did to earn his status. After this, we'll take a closer look at Pierluigi's music, and try to understand just what makes it so good. Pierluigi da Palestrina was born in the town of Palestrina, outside of Rome sometime around 1526. He was involved with music from a young age and worked and sang at the local chapel. Here he developed skills in music as well as built relationships with people that would prove to be extremely beneficial to him later in life. In 1544, when Pierluigi was 18 years old, he was hired by the Cathedral of Palestrina. There his responsibilities included playing the organ on festivals and singing daily at Mass, Vespers, and Compline. He also taught music to canons. For some confusing reason, the word canon has taken a broad variety of meanings, and in this case, canon refers to priests or leaders or administrators of the church. 3 years later, at the age of 21, he was married to Lucrezia di Goris. Palestrina's rise to success started when the bishop of the town of Palestrina got elected as pope in 1550. Palestrina had previously known the bishop from working at the local chapel. Soon after the pope's election, Palestrina was placed in the role of leading the choir of St. Peter's Basilica. The year this happened was 1551, so Palestrina would only have been 25 years old. Then again, the average life expectancy in the late Renaissance era wasn't even 40 years. So in a relative sense, I guess that could make 25 years old a mid-career age. It was here at St. Peter's that he published his first book of masses. This was the year 1554. He dedicated it to Pope Julius III and had it printed in a large format choir book that was sure to be easy to read for a whole church choir. It seems like dedicating this volume of masses to the Pope might have had some strategic purpose, because not long after beginning his choir lead role at St. Peter's, he was promoted by Pope Julius to singer in Cappella Sistina. Cappella Sistina is the choir of the Sistine Chapel, thus he would be singing directly to the Pope in this very prestigious new role. This would not be the only case of Pierluigi dedicating music to a pope. In fact, he dedicated music to nearly all the popes that held office during his lifetime. In fact, when Pierluigi began publishing in his job in Rome, he was the first Italian to dedicate music to a pope ever. Singers in Cappella Sistina were required to be celibate, but Pierluigi had been married for some time now, and thus did not satisfy this requirement. Pope Julius, however, made an exception so that Pierluigi could be in it. Unfortunately, Pope Julius did not live long, and so a new pope took office, Pope Marcellus II. Pope Marcellus presumably had a good relationship with Pierluigi, since he was the dedicatee of Pierluigi's most famous Mass, and plus he allowed him to continue singing in the Sistine Choir, even though he was technically ineligible. Unfortunately, poor Marcellus only survived a mere 3 weeks after election. At this point, Pierluigi's luck ran out with favorable popes, and he was finally dismissed from the Sistine Choir on account of his married status. Two other things that happened in the year 1555 were that Palestrina published his first book of madrigals, and more importantly, he became Maestro di Cappella at the Church of Giovanni Laterano. However, he left this 5 years later due to insufficient musical funding. During these 5 years, he did not publish any compositions, probably simply because he had little money to spare. In this time period, publishing music was very costly, and this cost was usually left only to the composers to bear. Leaving the church of Giovanni Laterano was kind of a turning point in Palestrina's life, and also in his journey to compositional stardom. As one might expect, Palestrina's skills had been gradually increasing throughout his life. Up until now, his compositions were good, but not quite the technical brilliance he is known for. As described by Henry Davy in his year 1899 written account of Palestrina's life, he was scientific, dull, and quaintly conceited. Davy attributed this to the Franco-Flemish style that had been dominating the late Renaissance polyphonic music scene. This was not to say that it wasn't good, but it just didn't stand out much with such a large body of similar music. But moving forward from here, Palestrina's work was dazzling. The first notable event was that Palestrina's Improperia was sung at the Sistine Chapel. This showed that Palestrina was beginning to gain a reputation as a seriously talented composer, probably helping people to see him as more than just a talented singer. No later than the year 1562, he composed Missa Papae Marcelli. If he really waited this long to compose this piece, it would be unusual because Pope Marcellus had died 7 years prior, leading one to speculate that it might have been composed when Marcellus was still living so that Palestrina could dedicate it to him. However, this beautiful composition would stick out like a sore thumb compared to his other compositions from around the time. A more likely theory is that of Lockwood, O'Regan, and Owens, who suggest that Missa Papae Marcelli was named as such because in Marcellus's time as pope, he made a specific request that music for Holy Week should have clearly understandable words, and this particular composition embraces that request, combining the charm of good polyphony with the sober clarity of church music intended to facilitate worship. Around this time, the famous Council of Trent was going down, and one of the results was that Pope Pius IV commissioned a reformation of the Sistine Choir. Upon hearing Missa Papae Marcelli, Pius recommended it as a model for sacred music going forward. As a result of this, Missa Papae Marcelli quickly became the gold standard for sacred masses at the time. Speaking of which, a mass is a sacred musical composition that theoretically would be performed at an actual mass church service. I say theoretically because the mass eventually became a musical subgenre that composers used without regard as to whether it would ever be played in a liturgical church service. Masses typically contain 5 main sections, and they are called Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, and Agnus Dei. From the 1570s to 80s, Palestrina focused on writing motets. In 1576, Palestrina's oldest son died, and then in 1580 his wife died, likely both due to influenza. He briefly considered becoming a priest, but ended up marrying another woman 7 months later, Virginia Dormuli. Virginia had sizable wealth, and this allowed Palestrina to publish a great deal more music than before. Having the monetary resources to publish was a factor he very consciously coped with. At one point, he apparently complained that he wasn't rich enough to get his works printed in splendid folio editions that his friend Vittorio was able to do. As I mentioned previously, publishing music in this time period was a very costly endeavor. In 1577, Palestrina, along with Annibale Zoilo, who was another composer and choir director like Palestrina, were tasked with revising official liturgical chant books used in Roman Catholic tradition, essentially to musically purify them from any errors or content that would be distracting to the message of the songs. He did a lot of work on this project but did not finish it in its entirety, possibly due to conflicting political tensions existing at the time. Between 1588 and 1594, he published volumes of lamentations, hymns, Magnificat settings, offertories, madrigals, litanies, and 2 masses. And then, in 1594, Palestrina died at the age of 68, survived only by one of his sons and a large amount of unpublished music. And now we will move on to discussing the style of Palestrina's music. Palestrina composed mostly sacred music, with only a few volumes of madrigals filling out his secular repertoire. He apparently had mixed feelings about his madrigals, as he once expressed embarrassment over their lacking seriousness in comparison to his other work. Palestrina's sacred works are primarily choral, unaccompanied by instruments. What makes his works so interesting is their brilliant utilization of polyphony. Polyphony is simply the combination of multiple voices singing independent melodies. Contrast this with a monophonic song, which would only have a single melody, or a homophonic song, which would have a single melody but could be accompanied by chords. Thus, polyphony is a type of musical texture. Polyphony is difficult because for it to sound good, the voices need to harmonize. But they must remain distinctly independent, since otherwise listeners will perceive only a single voice. As more voices are added, the task becomes very complicated. Fortunately, combining the separate melodies in a nice way is more than just guesswork. The framework of counterpoint allows composers to properly combine multiple melodies into a pleasant polyphony. Counterpoint emphasizes independence of melodies by utilizing contrapuntal motion. When one voice ascends in pitch while the other voice descends in pitch, it is called contrary motion. This kind of motion is the most effective for maintaining independence between the melodies. Another kind of frequently encountered motion is oblique motion, where one melody moves up or down while the second melody remains stationary on a single pitch. This kind of motion is often observed in Palestrina's songs. The least effective contrapuntal motion is called parallel motion, where both melodies move in the same direction with an unchanging interval. In Palestrina's work, a few notes of parallel motion is sometimes seen after a longer string of notes in contrary motion. There are several levels of counterpoint, and they are each governed by sets of rules. Here are some of the basic rules. When writing counterpoint, contrary motion should dominate, since this maximizes the independence between the voices. Motion should be distributed evenly between the lines. Intervals should be primarily consonant, and dissonances should be kept in small quantities. Fifths and octaves between the lines should be avoided, since these cause the previously independent lines to sound as though they have merged. Let's listen to a few samples of Palestrina's songs. Here we have Palestrina's Missa Pape Marcelli, the Kyrie section. This demonstrates how each voice operates independently, yet Palestrina ties them together with the pleasantly held note in the fourth bar. Notice the oblique motion seen in the third bar, where soprano 1 descends gracefully while the other parts hold steady. Also remarkable is that this mass is written for 6 separate voices. Now we hear Palestrina's Missa Brevis. Here you can observe Palestrina combining the voices in canon. Notice the repetition of the melody in the different voices. Also notice the contrary motion between the altus and bassus in the 5th measure. Interestingly, strongly parallel motion is observed between the cantus and altus voices in the 7th and 8th measures. Palestrina's counterpoint had a simple kind of elegance. Later, in the Baroque era, counterpoint evolved to become more complex. Bach was one of the legendary composers of the Baroque era. Although most of Bach's music is very different from the type of music Palestrina composed, one may still observe that Bach was influenced by the type of music Palestrina made. Consider Bach's Mass in B minor. Here, Bach was utilizing what eventually became known as stile antico, which basically means the traditional style, and it refers to the late Renaissance polyphonic style, which Palestrina's music is representative of. Liszt was even more directly impacted by Palestrina's work. He talks specifically about studying Palestrina and his contemporaries in some of his letters. He also took detailed notes on Palestrina's work. We now listen to one of Liszt's masses. You can hear how similar it is to Palestrina's style. It is a polyphonic choral work, with none of the voices in particular emphasized, just a completely uniform heavenly sound. Liszt also extends the Palestrina style to utilize a full orchestra in his oratorio, Christus. Palestrina's style was the first in Western music to be systematically isolated and preserved to be used as a model by other musicians. In some way, this shows how much of a technical genius Palestrina was. His name has come to represent the entire late Renaissance style of polyphonic music, and thus he has cemented himself as one of the many key figures of the history of music. He had tremendous skill and great influence, as is demonstrated by the many composers who have utilized the stile antico. One must ask oneself if his influence continues to live on today. This question has some inherent subjectivity, but setting this aside, we can analyze it in different levels. In Pierluigi's time, his influence was quite direct. He composed music that many people enjoyed and played. Nowadays, most of his music is not played so often, but though enjoyed by a smaller fraction of people, it is still very much enjoyed. But one can consider that his music influences the present in ways less directly than simply being played still. The evolution of music is much like a chain, with each link representing a new time period. Even though in the present we don't see much of the metaphorical link Palestrina's music provides, we can be assured that this link is holding strong, leading to the next link in the Baroque era, which in turn is holding strong to its next link all the way to the present. In other words, the present is built on the past, and for that reason Palestrina's music remains relevant. More importantly, Palestrina's music, as well as all the other great late Renaissance polyphonic music, is sure to have a special place in our hearts always, because it uniquely achieves something that no other genre infringes upon. In fact, these songs seem to offer a glimpse of purity, of true order, of musical holiness.